Peaceful protests turned violent in the nation's capital Monday to allow President Trump to pose for a photo op in front of the famous St. John's Church. Shortly before the 7 p.m. citywide curfew, police and the National Guard used flashbang explosives and tear gas in order to disperse a crowd that had been peacefully protesting in front of the White House. The aggressive action came just hours after President Trump promised to crack down on protests nationwide and vowed to send the U.S. military to states that could not control the rioting. The police intervention allowed President Trump to hold up a Bible and pose for a photo in front of the so-called Church of the Presidents. On Sunday, the landmark church had been vandalized during the ongoing protests against police brutality. The president's decision to use the damaged church as background and the Bible as a prop has caused widespread criticism from religious leaders and lawmakers alike. Joining us now is Reverend Dr. Nichole R. Phillips. She's a senior faculty fellow at the Emory Center for Ethics, an associate professor in the practice of sociology of religion and culture, and the director of Black Church Studies at Emory University. Welcome, Reverend Phillips. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
As we heard, the president has not been one to frequent that church since his inauguration. So how was this latest photo op received by the church community?
Well, I can't speak for the entire church community, but I can speak for myself as a clergy person. And as you stated, there has been uproar. However, given the president's behavior as well as his rhetoric over the last 4 years, at this point, many of his actions are not surprising. I liken what he did to the debate on civil discourse that has been happening throughout the nation over the last 4 years. And so even though it was an action, it was preceded by what I consider uncivil discourse. And if we are comparing the rioting to uncivil discourse, what he has said as well as what he has done escalates versus de-escalates the violence. And I think that it, in many respects, can be worse than and is worse than the rioting. And so, as you stated, because of what he did, it increased as opposed to in our expectation of a leader, especially our political leaders, is that they would find a way to contain what might be considered behavior that needs to be constrained. Because as we know, and as many people... Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please finish.
So as we recognize at this point, Martin Luther King essentially says that the rioting is the language of the oppressed.
And then I'm wondering what you think about Mr. Trump's words when he was outside of St. John's. I mean, he spoke about keeping America, quote, nice and safe, but made no reference to George Floyd, racial inequality, or police brutality, which is currently at the heart of these protests. So he seemed to be sort of missing the heart of the matter. What message do you think he is delivering to the Black community and the country as a whole in the way he continually addresses these ongoing issues? And I also want to point out that some people have noted, he seemed more sympathetic to armed militia that were storming state capitals in protest of the lockdown than he is to some of these protesters.
Mm-hmm. Well, for many, his actions were offensive. Some might consider it patriotic. I don't miss the fact that he decided to raise a Bible and stand in front of a church. What I definitely think he is communicating is a particular type of what we understand as an American civil religion or a common faith that undergirds how we understand ourselves as American, but he is definitely delivering a particular way of understanding what it means to be American. So for those who are part of his base, who might be more religiously conservative or evangelicals, how his symbolism might have been accepted and acceptable, but for those of us who have a different understanding of what it means to be American, a Colin Kaepernick and Colin Kaepernick's kneeling, which I take it as at the time in which he usually kneels as a civil religious act, and it's an act that indicates that America has broken and continuously breaks its promises to its covenants to the Black community, and that would include the religious community. And so what I can say is it is offensive for many of us. I can't discount that for some, what he did might be patriotic, but there are different ways to understand the democratic project, and the protests that we are seeing are understanding of the democratic project as one that is based on universal covenants and values that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. And African Americans and Black Americans aren't saying that we are attempting to leave America, but we want a corrective to these racist and racial situations.
And if these protests continue, and if, as we saw on Monday, the law enforcement side becomes the aggressor, as in the case that they wanted to clear the space for the president, what type of action then can protesters take in order to keep these demonstrations peaceful, if that is the goal, Reverend?
So if it is the goal to keep the protests peaceful, well, I think in some respects, much of the reporting on the ground is that the protests are peaceful until outsiders, anarchists, come in and precipitate the violence. And then because the emotions are so high, our young people and protesters respond to the violence. What I believe is that there are multi-generations of protesters, as well as coalitions of people. As we see, there's white, there's Black, there's young, there's old. And one of the ways, and as I've been looking through social media, one of the ways is to keep the protests peaceful is to have those who either are more mature and older, hold younger people accountable and really explain that the way for change is voting. Although I recognize that we have young people who says, I have voted and look what is not happening. And we challenge you. We are voting. We are putting you into office, and we want to see change, and we're not seeing it. And so with the multi-generations and with the coalitions, I think that on the ground, those people working together can have a voice to contain some of the more volatile emotions and explosions that are happening.
Reverend Dr. Nichole Phillips, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight and perspective on all this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.